Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but I do appreciate the opportunity to share this message from the thoughts that I've been having since I attended Synod. So, Mark tells the story of a day that Jesus was passing through a town, and he presumably had crowds all around him, and he heard a voice cry out to him. And blind Bartimaeus was brought to Jesus. And Jesus said, "What do you want?" And Bartimaeus said, "Lord, I want to see." And Jesus sent Bartimaeus away after having restored his sight. So that was my prayer one morning recently. Lord, I want to see. And God said, I don't think you do. I thought of some of the things people post on Facebook, pictures of abused and suffering animals and suffering people. And I thought of the women and girls in Afghanistan who have to suffer again under the Taliban. And I thought of the refugees fleeing Haiti that were living under a bridge in Texas and then were sent back to Haiti, which is devastated. And I thought of the victims of the wildfires out west and the families of the 700,000 plus people dead of COVID. And I know that I can't cope with what God sees. So no, I don't want to see. And I started to cry, but I felt like God was with me and saying, it's okay. I know that you can't cope with what I see, but you can look where I tell you to look. I can look where God tells me to look. But do I have eyes and fail to see? Do I have ears and fail to hear? Do we have eyes and fail to see? Do we have ears and fail to hear? So I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been questioning my place in the UCC. So 5 years ago, my husband Jay and I moved to Waynesboro from Northern Virginia. Sorry about the clock. Jay's dad is a retired United Methodist pastor in York. And we met and married in a United Methodist church. We baptized and raised our kids in the United Methodist Church, and we served as leaders in our United Methodist Church. But as we prepared to move, the United Methodist Church was struggling with questions around the inclusion of the LGBTQ community. Knowing that our new community is far more conservative than Northern Virginia, we worried a little about finding a new church home. And our pastor suggested trying out the UCC if we weren't happy with the Methodist churches here. Well, we weren't happy with the Methodist churches in Waynesboro, but when we visited Trinity UCC, we felt welcomed and at home. But as I said, I've begun to wonder how well I fit in the UCC. I have a deep faith. It's one that's been challenged, and there have been times when I have doubted. There have been dark nights of my soul, and God has seen me through. These times, with everything going on in the world, seem a bit like a dark night, and I imagine myself in a pitch black tunnel, desperately holding on to God's hand, knowing that God will see me and us through to the other side. Right now, though, I'm struggling because I'm not sure what the UCC believes. I know what the UCC Statement of Faith says, but I also know that there are leaders in our church who think very differently than I do, which isn't a bad thing, but at what point do we stop being church and become a social club? I know that in this church, some of us believe in the virgin birth, in the divinity of Jesus, and in the resurrection. Others don't or don't know what they think. Some that I have spoken with tell me they don't believe in the magical Jesus. They don't believe in the resurrection. And it is not my place to judge or to tell them what to think. But to me, if we don't have these things, then I ask, what's the point? What is the point of the prayers and the sermons and the words we say if we don't believe? Why not just come and listen to the music and drink some coffee? We can do good things without sitting in a pew for an hour on Sunday. To me, and I preface all of this with that phrase, to me, if we don't have the virgin birth, then what's the point? I don't know that it happened exactly like Luke wrote it, and I am quite sure that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John used literary license to tell their stories. But let's imagine for a moment that Mary had a tryst with Joseph or another man, got pregnant, and knowing she was going to be stoned, the two of them cooked up a great lie. And she said, I know. Let's say it was the Holy Spirit and I'm a virgin. Well, it would have been a really good lie. And they would have had to be really good liars because they've been believed for 2,000 years. But let's just say it's so. So Jesus then was just an illegitimate kid who was really smart, studied the scriptures a lot, and was a great teacher. He would have been fully human. And I do need Jesus to be fully human. I need Jesus, God, to know what it's like to be tired, to get sick, to laugh, to love, to be hungry and scared, and to suffer. The human Jesus makes God more accessible to me. But I also need Jesus to be fully divine. Or what is the point? How can I have hope that horrible situations will get better because someone bigger than humans is at work there? There are problems in this world that are insurmountable to people. But I have to believe that God is present and working, and God can overcome anything. So I believe that in addition to being fully human, Jesus is fully divine. It makes sense to me then that he could do miracles. He could turn water into wine and feed 5,000 people with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish and restore sight to the blind. And I think he needed to do these things to prove to the people he met along his way that he was more than just a gifted teacher. I need Jesus to be fully human as he hangs on that cross because I want to have a little understanding of how much he loves me that he was willing to suffer that agony. I need to know he was fully human as he hung on that cross because it helps me to understand that horrible things will happen, but God remains present with us. God doesn't cause or allow bad things, but God doesn't forsake us as we suffer either. If Jesus could suffer such torment, then why shouldn't I? The fully divine Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen and why, but the fully human Jesus still asked that the cup be taken from him. And then there was the resurrection. If at my death there is nothingness, well, I don't suppose I'll care because I'll be dead. But I've had a good life with plenty of joy and some traumas and some heartache along the way. Overall, I'd say it's been a really good life. So if at my death there is nothing, I guess I can accept that. But I reject the concept of nothingness for all those who have not had a life like mine. The babies who die shortly after birth, the children with chronic illnesses, the mothers in areas of famine watching their children starve to death, the people of Haiti who live in grinding poverty and have seen their country shattered again and again and again. The women and girls in Afghanistan who are finding out what life for them under the Taliban is and isn't. This can't be all there is for them. Where is their hope? I can't accept that a loving God would just shrug and say, well, sucks to be you. So I believe in the magical, in the divine Jesus. I think God is quite capable of creating the world out of nothing and creating humankind and turning water into wine and growing a tree out of a tiny mustard seed and making a lame man walk again and raising Jesus from the dead. Otherwise, what's the point? It is this faith in a fully human and fully divine Jesus that sustains me when I have to look at things I don't want to see and hear things I don't want to hear. We have all had to turn off the news at one time or another during this past year. We need to stop looking and listening when our mental health just can't take it anymore. And that point has come and gone again and again this year. Is it bad to look away or stop listening when there really is absolutely nothing we can do? People are going to abuse their spouses, their children, their animals, and each other. Wars are going to be fought. People will vote for a candidate I abhor, and I know that I'm voting for a candidate they abhor. I can't stop the Taliban from mistreating people in Afghanistan. I don't know whether it was right or not to withdraw American troops. I'm not a military strategist or diplomat. I can't heal the divisions in our country. I can't even convince people to wear masks or get vaccinated. Lord, I want to see. But sometimes we have to look away. And sometimes we need a break from listening. But faith tells us that God never looks away and never stops listening. Every 2 years, we in the UCC participate in General Synod and wrestle with what God is asking us to do. We in the UCC say that we believe that God is still speaking. Are we listening? The theme of General Synod this year was rooted in love. I learned that there are really good people in the Penn Central Conference. I learned that we are still embarrassed to follow Jesus. I learned that we are still not listening. I learned that we are still at war with the indigenous peoples of Hawaii. I learned that every year the resolution about a just peace between Israel and Palestine passes, but nothing changes. Do we want to see? Do we want to hear? Are we looking and listening? What's the point? I was assigned to the committee to review the resolution for a just peace between Israel and Palestine. The resolution calls on the nation-state of Israel to stop oppressing the people of Palestine. There was a lot of conversation around the words sin and apartheid. Those that objected to the use of the words were afraid that we would offend our Jewish brothers and sisters. My personal feeling was that, first of all, we need to use words like that to get people's attention. And second of all, these were the words used by the Palestinian people who wrote them. If they feel that they are living in apartheid, don't we need to listen to them? We are so worried about offending someone. Jesus wasn't afraid to offend people when he needed to. Why are we? The committee chose to tone down the language, but when it came up in plenary, the authors were ready. The echo of the last word hadn't yet died away from the report of the committee when motions were made to restore the language. The motions passed, and ultimately the resolution did too. But do we care? Yeah, Israel, Palestine, they're over in the Middle East and they don't really affect me. And Israel is God's chosen people and they deserve their space and we can't have the second coming until Israel is restored. We aren't listening. The Palestinians are part of God's kingdom too and need to have their voices heard. But if we don't know what is happening, if we don't know about the resolution, what's the point? There was the usual resolution about nature and God's creation. Last time, it was about reducing the use of styrofoam, submitted by our very own Trinity UCC. I didn't realize that it wasn't even controversial. Everyone knew that was going to pass except me, because I had written it and was there to see it through and had never participated in the UCC General Synod before. This time, the resolution was titled, "Who Will Speak for the Trees?" Beloveds, we need to speak for the trees. Our planet is on fire. What happens when the firefighters are too exhausted to continue in California? What happens when the fire starts in Michaud State Forest right here in Waynesboro? It might not be soon, but make no mistake, the fires will come. The city of Orlando, Florida, has asked its residents to restrict their water use because water is necessary to provide oxygen to the hospitals and all the COVID patients who need it. We are at a place where we are choosing between water and oxygen. And we aren't listening because it's uncomfortable and expensive, and partly because we don't know what to do about it. Everyone knew this resolution would pass, though, because environmental resolutions always do. But what is the point if nothing changes? The resolution encouraging an end to 128 years of war between the United States of America and the Hawaiian Kingdom was interesting. Did you even know that there was a war between the United States and the Hawaiian Kingdom? I didn't, not that I ever really thought about it. The resolution was brought by the UCC's Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches, which consists of 31 historically Native Hawaiian congregations. The folks that served on this committee, including Reverend Dr. Carrie Call, worked long into the night to get this one just right. When it came up in plenary, though, there were people from Hawaii saying that all Hawaiian voices had not been heard. The thing was, the people saying they were Native Hawaiians and hadn't been heard were white Native Hawaiians. They weren't members of the Hawaiian Kingdom. All sorts of fireworks erupted when the resolution failed. Reverend John Dorhauer immediately led a prayer, and his voice was shaking. The next day, there were motions to reopen debate on the resolution because people felt it had been rushed through. And this, apparently, is unheard of, so there was debate about whether this was even legal. Ultimately, however, the resolution was reopened, and this time it did pass. The resolution calls for, and I quote, the United Church of Christ General Counsel's Office to listen to and consider recommendations from the Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches, other Native Hawaiian organizations, and Native Hawaiian voices drafting communications to local, national, and international leaders and organizations calling for compliance with international humanitarian law and an end to the illegal occupation of the Hawaiian Islands. So this resolution was written by Indigenous people, members of the Hawaiian Kingdom, who still feel marginalized. Speaking against it were white voices who felt that their interests were not being considered. After the resolution failed, I attended an implementation seminar. There wasn't anything to implement as the resolution hadn't passed, and the author was in tears. That is how passionate he felt about the injustice that he and his fellow Hawaiians are experiencing. But we weren't listening. I'm glad to say the next day the resolution did pass because there were some really loud voices who demanded that it be reinstated. But so what? I don't know where resolutions go when they pass, so what's the point? The resolution calling for a ban on conversion or reparative therapy passed easily. Conversion therapy, in which LGBTQ persons are cured of their homosexuality, is banned on minors in 20 states. Not even half. 20 states. But it remains legal for adults in all 50 states. Proponents noted that the damage done to the mental health of those who undergo conversion therapy, the horrifying rate of suicide, and the appalling implication that nonconforming sexual identity and gender fluidity is a disease. The resolution strongly urges local congregations to work to achieve a ban on the practice. But are we listening? We live in a pretty conservative part of the state. Will we act beyond maybe voting to become open and affirming? What's the point? The resolution calling for gender equity and safety in ministry settings for women, transgender, gender expansive, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, and two-spirit persons, both lay and authorized ministers, passed without debate, as it should have. But did you know that there is still gender inequity in the ministry? As the mother of a daughter in seminary, I pray for her safety and well-being. But unless we look at ourselves and listen to those who are suffering, we won't change anything. What's the point? Members of the UCC Southern Conference brought a resolution to reform the cash bail bond system. As one proponent noted, the cash bail bond system doesn't keep people accused of crimes in jail. It keeps poor people accused of crimes in jail. Do we care? What's the point? The Council of Health and Human Ministries brought a resolution affirming racism as a public health crisis. They already have a curriculum ready to go. Will we read it or will we look away? What was the point of spending precious time and money to write, review, rewrite, present, and vote on the resolutions? I am unhappy to tell you that I still can't find the resolutions on the UCC homepage. The national office referred me to the Southern Conference, who wrote a very good synopsis. And there is a slide at the end of the presentation with the link, so that if you want to look it up, you can do so, and I encourage you to read it. If the resolutions aren't on the website where someone who didn't attend Synod, which is most of us, can find it easily, nothing will change. What was the point? I can tell you that the Penn Central Conference has identified who will speak for the trees and racism as a public health crisis as high priorities for our conference. I hope each of you will advocate within your local churches for each of these resolutions. The resolutions at General Synod encourage us to listen and look. Let those with eyes to see, and those with ears to hear, hear. Let's look at our laws, our traditions, our myths and beliefs, and find the places where God calls us to do better. Let's listen to Indigenous peoples, the marginalized, women, the LGBTQ community. Listen and don't look away. Or what was the point of even having Synod? And that brings me to the last resolution that I want to talk about today. Becoming a church of contemplatives in action was proposed by 13 local congregations from Massachusetts, Illinois, Maryland, New York, Ohio, and Vermont, and passed overwhelmingly on the first day of Synod. The UCC is known for bold leadership on social justice, peace, and environmental concerns. The resolution calls on us to integrate our social justice initiatives with a life of prayer. Here's the summary as it's written in the resolution. The United Church of Christ is known historically as a denomination for its bold leadership on social justice, peace, and environmental concerns. This resolution seeks the Church's integration of action for justice alongside intentional commitment to the life of prayer. Through fostering spiritual practices that deepen us in love for God, neighbors, ourselves, and all creation, this resolution would empower the UCC to more fully root its collective life of activism for justice in the prayerful life of contemplation. By declaring its support for this resolution, the General Synod will emphasize the necessity of experiential grounding in the love of God alongside our common witness for justice and peace, while resourcing the wider church and the diversity of spiritual disciplines. The United Church of Christ's great strength is in its work for social justice. But if we aren't spending time reading our holy scriptures, talking about faith, and studying together, how can we know what God is saying? What does it say about one of our churches that the hymnals made it back into the pew racks after the pandemic shut down, but the Bibles didn't? If we never open those Bibles, we miss hearing the voice of God. I love listening to church music. I love the decorations on the altar and the banners and the Christmas tree and the cross at Easter. I know what is in those little communion cup. What is in the little communion cup is juice or wine, and it's not really blood. And whatever those little wafer things are, I know they aren't flesh. But receiving or serving communion is an intimate act of faith that I love. To me, they're more than a cup of blessing. They represent the deep love and sacrifice that Jesus Christ, fully God and fully human, demonstrated for me. If we aren't contemplating what it all means, then what is the point? We call ourselves the United Church of Christ, not the United Church of Social Justice. In my opinion, we need to recenter ourselves around Christ. Social justice doesn't call us to Christ. It is Christ who calls us to social justice, and we need to remember that. Amen.